pre-dawn darkness of August 19th, 1942, shrouded the English Channel in an eerie silence that would soon be shattered by one of the most catastrophic Allied operations of World War II. 6,000 men aboard 237 ships approached the fortified French port of Dieppe, their hearts pounding with anticipation and dread. They had no idea they were sailing toward a slaughter that would change the course of the war forever. Major General John Hamilton Roberts stood on the bridge of the destroyer HMS Calpe, watching the French coastline emerge from the morning mist. The 47-year-old Canadian commander had been tasked with leading Operation Jubilee, an ambitious amphibious assault designed to test German coastal defenses and boost Allied morale. The operation had been months in the planning, born from mounting pressure to open a second front in Europe and demonstrate Allied capability to a skeptical Soviet Union. The original plan had been ambitious, yet seemingly straightforward. The 2nd Canadian Division would spearhead the main assault on Dieppe's beaches, supported by British commandos who would neutralize the heavy gun batteries at Bourneville and Varangeville. 50 United States Army Rangers would participate in their first European ground combat, while 15 French commandos would provide local intelligence. The raid was intended to last only a few hours, long enough to destroy port facilities, capture prisoners, and gather intelligence before withdrawing. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the horizon, the German coastal defenses of the Atlantic Wall loomed before them like a medieval fortress. The port of Dieppe sat nestled between towering chalk cliffs, its beaches covered with barbed wire and defended by concrete bunkers bristling with machine guns. Unknown to the Allied planners, the German 15th Army had been reinforced in recent weeks, and their intelligence networks had already detected suspicious Allied activity. The silence was broken at 4:47 in the morning when a German convoy unexpectedly encountered the Eastern Task Force. The element of surprise, so crucial to the mission's success, evaporated in a series of violent naval exchanges. Tracer fire lit up the darkness as German E-boats engaged Allied destroyers, sending flares into the sky that illuminated the entire invasion fleet. Lieutenant Colonel John Foote, the chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, watched the first explosions from his landing craft and whispered a prayer for the men around him. These young Canadians, many barely out of their teens, were about to face their first taste of combat. They had trained for months in the Scottish Highlands, practicing amphibious landings and street fighting, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited on the beaches of Dieppe. The German defenders, now fully alert, began a systematic preparation for the incoming assault. Artillery pieces were loaded, machine gun nests were manned, and mortar crews received their targeting coordinates. The Wehrmacht had spent 2 years fortifying this coastline, and they were about to demonstrate the deadly effectiveness of their preparations. As the landing craft approached the shoreline, the sound of engines mixed with the nervous chatter of soldiers checking their weapons one final time. The Royal Regiment of Canada was heading for Blue Beach at Puys, the Essex Scottish Regiment toward Red Beach at Dieppe proper, and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry toward White Beach. Each unit carried specific objectives to capture the town, destroy the port facilities, establish a temporary foothold on Nazi-occupied Europe. The men had been told this would be a reconnaissance in force, a bold stroke that would test German defenses and provide valuable intelligence for future operations. What they were about to discover was that the Atlantic Wall was far more formidable than Allied intelligence had estimated, and that the cost of this knowledge would be measured in thousands of casualties. At precisely 5 o'clock in the morning, the landing craft reached the beaches of Dieppe, and the nightmare began. The Royal Regiment of Canada, approaching Blue Beach at Puys, found themselves facing an impossible situation. The narrow beach was completely inflated by German machine gun positions carved into the chalk cliffs above. As the first wave of Canadians stumbled onto the pebbled shore, they were met by a withering crossfire that cut them down like wheat before a scythe. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Caddo, commanding the Royal Regiment, was among the first to fall. His men, trapped between the unforgiving sea and the deadly cliff-top positions, had nowhere to take cover. The German 32nd Infantry Division had positioned their weapons with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing zone. Within minutes, the assault had stalled completely. according to historical accounts documented by the Juno Beach Center. The ground forces taking part in the raid included 4,963 men and officers from the 2nd Canadian Division, 1,005 British commandos, 50 United States Rangers, and 15 Frenchmen, all transported by a fleet of 237 ships and landing barges. 2 miles to the west, the Essex Scottish Regiment was experiencing a similar fate on Red Beach. These men from Ontario had trained extensively for urban warfare, but they found themselves pinned down on an open beach with no cover except the bodies of their fallen comrades. The German defenders had prepared for exactly this type of assault, with pre-sighted mortar and artillery pieces that could target any point on the beach with deadly accuracy. Private John Edmondson of the Essex Scottish watched in horror as his section commander was torn apart by machine gun fire just yards from the water's edge. The 19-year-old from Windsor had joined the army to fight fascism, but he had never imagined anything like this. The beach was becoming a charnel house, with Canadian soldiers falling in waves as they struggled to advance across the exposed shingle. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, landing on White Beach, faced a slightly different but equally deadly situation. They managed to penetrate into the town itself, where fierce street fighting erupted among the narrow medieval streets. Sergeant Major Stewart of the Rileys led his men through the casino and into the town square, where they encountered determined resistance from German infantry supported by tanks. The casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. The German defenders, many of them seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front, fought with professional efficiency. They had been expecting this attack for weeks, and their preparations showed. Every building had been turned into a fortress. Every street corner concealed a machine gun nest, and every alley was covered by sniper fire. Meanwhile, the British commandos were achieving the only successes of the day. No. 4 Commando, led by Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovett, had managed to silence the battery at Varangeville through a brilliantly executed flanking maneuver. Aristocratic Scottish officer had divided his force, sending one group to create a diversion, while the other attacked from an unexpected direction. The German gunners, caught completely off guard, were quickly overwhelmed. At Berneval, however, No. 3 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford-Slater faced a more difficult situation. The earlier naval engagement had scattered their landing craft, and only a small portion of the force had made it to the correct beach. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the commandos managed to keep the German battery occupied and prevent it from engaging the main landings. The American Rangers, experiencing their first taste of European combat, found themselves in the thick of the action at Dieppe proper. Captain Roy Murray led his men through the deadly streets, where they encountered German resistance that was far more organized and effective than anything they had faced in training. The Rangers, though small in number, fought with characteristic American determination. But they too were being ground down by the superior German positions. By 7 o'clock in the morning, it was becoming clear that the operation was failing catastrophically. The beaches were littered with Canadian casualties. The town remained firmly in German hands, and the Royal Air Force was engaged in a desperate battle overhead to maintain air superiority. The sound of aircraft engines mixed with the constant chatter of machine guns and the explosion of mortar was creating a symphony of destruction that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the morning sun climbed higher over the blood-soaked beaches of Dieppe, individual acts of extraordinary courage began to emerge from the chaos of the failing operation. The disaster was complete, but the human spirit of the Allied forces refused to be broken, even in the face of certain defeat. Captain John Foote, the chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, became a symbol of selfless heroism that would inspire generations. The 37-year-old minister from Ontario had initially landed with the reserves, but as the casualties mounted, he moved forward to the front lines. Under heavy fire, Foote moved from wounded man to wounded man, providing medical aid and spiritual comfort to soldiers who would never see home again. The chaplain's actions defied all military logic. He repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to drag wounded Canadians to safety, his uniform becoming increasingly stained with blood as the morning wore on. When evacuation craft finally arrived at White Beach, Foote was offered a place aboard, but he made a decision that would define his legacy. He stepped back onto the beach, choosing to remain with the wounded who could not be evacuated, knowing full well that this meant certain capture. At Blue Beach, where the Royal Regiment of Canada had been virtually annihilated, Sergeant Major George Gooch was performing his own acts of heroism. The veteran soldier from New Brunswick organized the surviving members of his unit into defensive positions among the rocks and debris. Though mortally wounded himself, Gooch continued to direct covering fire that allowed some of his men to reach the relative safety of the seawall. The German defenders, despite their tactical success, were witnessing something that would stay with them forever. Obergefreiter Hans Müller of the 32nd Infantry Division later recalled watching Canadian soldiers continue to advance despite taking horrific casualties. The young German machine gunner, barely 20 years old, found himself both horrified and oddly impressed by the determination of his enemies. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force was fighting its own desperate battle in the skies above Dieppe. Squadron leader Keith Park had committed every available fighter to the operation, determined to provide air cover for the ground forces. The result was the largest air battle over Western Europe since the Battle of Britain. Spitfires and Hurricanes, tangled with Messerschmitt fighters in a deadly dance that would claim over 100 Allied aircraft, Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bader, a legendary legless pilot, led his squadron in repeated attacks on German positions. Despite having lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident, Bader had become one of the Royal Air Force's most aggressive fighter leaders. His Squadron 302 engaged German fighters with characteristic fury, but even his exceptional skill could not change the fundamental reality that the ground operation was failing. The German Luftwaffe, commanded by Field Marshal Hugo Sparrell, had prepared extensively for this moment. Every available aircraft in northern France had been committed to the battle, and the German pilots fought with the confidence of men defending their homeland. The sky above Dieppe became a graveyard of aircraft from both sides with parachutes, dotting the horizon as pilots from both nations struggled to survive. In the town itself, the street fighting had reached a level of intensity that exceeded even the Eastern Front. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, supported by Churchill tanks, of the Calgary Regiment, had managed to penetrate several blocks into Dieppe proper. The urban warfare was conducted building by building, room by room, with both sides showing no quarter. Private Ernest Alvius Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, though not officially part of the Dieppe operation, had somehow made his way to the beaches and joined the fighting. The future Victoria Cross recipient demonstrated the kind of individual initiative that would later make him famous, single-handedly eliminating several German machine gun positions with grenades and rifle fire. The German defenders were equally impressive in their professional competence. Major General Konrad Haas, commanding the 15th Army units in the area, had positioned his forces with exceptional skill. Artillery and armor was textbook perfect. The Wehrmacht was demonstrating why it was considered the finest military force in the world. As the morning progressed, it became increasingly clear that the operation would have to be abandoned. The beaches were becoming untenable. The casualties were mounting beyond any acceptable level, and the objectives of the raid remained completely unachieved. The decision to evacuate would have to be made soon, but extracting the survivors would prove to be as dangerous as the original landing. The courage displayed by individual soldiers on both sides would become the stuff of legend, but it could not alter the fundamental reality that Operation Jubilee had become a catastrophic failure. The lessons learned from this disaster would eventually contribute to the success of D-Day, but that knowledge would come at a terrible price in Canadian blood. The German response to the raid also provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and tactics. The speed and efficiency with which the Wehrmacht had reacted to the landings demonstrated the high quality of German training and equipment. Future Allied operations would have to account for this level of professional competence in enemy forces. The psychological impact of the disaster on Allied morale was significant, but it also served to steel the resolve of military leaders who understood that such failures could not be repeated. The knowledge that thousands of brave men had died for nothing created a sense of responsibility that would drive the meticulous planning of future operations. The Canadian government, faced with the devastating losses suffered by the 2nd Canadian Division, demanded a full accounting of the decisions that had led to the disaster. The political ramifications of the operation would influence Canadian military policy for the remainder of the war, with a new emphasis on ensuring that Canadian forces were not sacrificed in poorly planned operations. The German reaction to their victory at Dieppe was more complex than might have been expected. While they celebrated their tactical success, senior German commanders recognized that the operation had been a reconnaissance in force that provided valuable intelligence about Allied capabilities and intentions. The knowledge that the Allies were actively planning a return to Europe forced the Germans to accelerate their defensive preparations. The lessons learned from the Dieppe disaster would eventually contribute to the success of Operation Overlord, the DA invasion that would establish the Second Front in Europe. Every aspect of the Normandy landings reflected knowledge gained from the bloody beaches of Dieppe. From the massive naval bombardments to the specialized equipment used by the assault forces, the shadows of the Dieppe disaster would stretch across the remainder of World War II and beyond, fundamentally altering Allied strategy and shaping the eventual victory in Europe. The operation that had begun as a bold demonstration of Allied capability had instead become a costly education in the realities of amphibious warfare. Paid for with the blood of thousands of brave young men, the most immediate and profound impact of the disaster was on the planning for Operation Overlord. The D-Day invasion that would finally establish the Second Front in Europe. General Dwight David Eisenhower, appointed as Supreme Allied Commander, made the study of the Dieppe failure a priority for his planning staff. Every mistake made at Dieppe would be carefully avoided in the preparation for Normandy. The scale of the DID operation reflected the lessons learned from Dieppe, where Operation Jubilee had involved 6,000 men. Operation Overlord would land over 150,000 troops on the first day alone. The massive naval bombardment that preceded the Normandy landings was a direct response to the inadequate fire support provided at Dieppe. The German defenses would not be left intact to slaughter the attacking forces as they had at Dieppe. The specialized equipment developed for D-Day also reflected the Dieppe experience. The famous Hobart's Funnies, specialized tanks designed to overcome beach obstacles, were developed specifically to address the problems encountered by the Calgary Regiment at Dieppe. The artificial harbors constructed for the Normandy invasion were designed to avoid the need to capture a heavily defended port, as had been attempted at Dieppe. The intelligence apparatus that supported D-Day was far more sophisticated than anything available for the Dieppe operation. The extensive use of aerial reconnaissance, resistance networks, and code breaking had been refined in response to the intelligence failures that had contributed to the disaster. The Allies would never again underestimate the strength of German defenses as they had at Dieppe. The memorial services held for the Dieppe casualties became annual reminders of the cost of the operation. In the small Canadian town of Hamilton, Ontario, the memorial to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry became a place of pilgrimage for families who had lost sons, husbands, and brothers in the failed raid. The regimental chapel displayed the names of the hundreds of men who had died on the beaches of France. their sacrifice remembered even as the strategic value of their deaths remained questionable. Captain John Foote, who had chosen to remain on the beach with the wounded, was eventually repatriated after the war and awarded the Victoria Cross for his extraordinary courage. The chaplain's story became a symbol of the heroism displayed by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. His decision to stay with the wounded, knowing it meant certain captivity, represented the highest ideals of military service. The German defenders of Dieppe would also carry the memory of the battle for the rest of their lives. Many of them had been impressed by the courage of the Canadian soldiers who had continued to advance despite hopeless odds. The mutual respect that developed between former enemies would become a foundation for post-war reconciliation between Germany and the Allied nations. The strategic impact of the Dieppe disaster extended far beyond military planning. The operation had been intended, in part, to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that the Western Allies were serious about opening a second front in Europe. The failure had the opposite effect, reinforcing Soviet suspicions that their allies were content to let the Red Army bear the primary burden of fighting Germany. The political consequences of the disaster were equally significant. The Canadian government's confidence in British military leadership was severely shaken, leading to demands for greater Canadian control over the deployment of Canadian forces. The disaster contributed to the development of a more independent Canadian military policy that would persist long after the war ended. The technological innovations that emerged from the Dieppe experience would have applications far beyond World War II. The development of specialized amphibious equipment, improved medical evacuation procedures, and enhanced air-ground cooperation would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The lessons learned at such a terrible cost would be passed on to future generations of military planners. The human cost of the operation, the 916 Canadian soldiers who died, and the nearly 2,000 who were captured, represented more than just statistics. These were young men with hopes, dreams, and families who had volunteered to serve their country in its hour of need. Their sacrifice, while strategically questionable, demonstrated the courage and dedication of the men who fought in the Second World War. The ultimate irony of the Dieppe disaster was that its failure may have contributed more to Allied victory than its success ever could have. The lessons learned from the operation were so fundamental to the planning of DID that the Normandy invasion might well have failed without the costly education provided by the disaster at Dieppe. The young men who died on those French beaches had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had taught the Allies how to win the war. The memory of Dieppe serves as a reminder that victory in war often comes at a terrible price, and that the courage of individual soldiers can transcend even the most catastrophic military failures. The raid that had been intended to last only a few hours had effects that would last for generations, shaping military doctrine and serving as a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity.